Let's start shortly. There you go.
Thank you. Okay, so good morning, everybody. Now, before we start, maybe I shall answer Riham's question. Good morning, I am a MA student from another institute. Is it okay for me to attend this online session? Of course, you're most welcome. This is a public session, and it is my pleasure to welcome you and all the attendees of this session. This is the fourth online session of the Syflat Research Methodology Seminars. It is a series of seminars jointly organized by the Systemic Functional Linguistics Association of Tunisia, the Laboratory Approaches to Discourse, and the Doctoral School at the Faculty of Letters and Humanities of Sfax. And it is my pleasure today, and Syflat's pleasure, to welcome Professor Louise Mycock from the University of Oxford. She's going to talk about coherence and attitude, analyzing the Protag construction over time. Now, maybe before I give her the floor, I shall introduce her to our dear participants. Dr. Louise Mycock is an associate professor in linguistics at the Faculty of Linguistics, Philology, and Phonetics at the University of Oxford, and tutorial fellow in linguistics at Somerville College, Oxford again. She received her PhD from the University of Manchester, where she subsequently took up a Faculty of Humanities Research Fellowship, as well as a British Academy postdoctoral fellowship that was also held at the University of Oxford. Her principal research interests are in syntax and syntactic theory, information structure, cross-linguistic and dialectical variation, and linguistic interfaces and interface phenomena, in particular pragmatic markers in different varieties of English. So that's a profile that is highly appreciated both at the Syflat and the Laboratory Approaches to Discourse, this interface between syntax, meaning, and pragmatics. So, Dr. Louise Mycock, thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and we look forward to listening to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation as well. It's really great to be able to speak to you like this. So let's try some technical things. I have a video. Oh, hang on. I'm just going to stop the sharing because I don't think I enabled the sound. So I have a video, so I want to be able for you to hear that as well. Okay. I think that should... Okay, you should be able to see a squirrel. That's not my talk. Yes. Not a nature talk. I hope that you can see the main page.
Yes.
Okay. As you've kindly introduced, this is a talk about coherence and attitude, and it's about the Protag construction over time. So my work is predominantly here in a corpus perspective. So where are we going to go with this? Well, what's ahead today is I'm going to introduce the construction to you. It's one that many native speakers of English aren't even aware that they use. And we'll look at its form and occurrence in present-day British English. So that is the PDBE that you see there. Then I'll talk a little bit about the history of English and protags. And then we'll look at their functions and the developmental pathway of those functions over time. But what I'd like to do is start with a video that I hope the sound works for, but if it doesn't, you'll see the text on the screen. And this is an example of a Protag construction taken from a recent TV advert for a UK bank, and it's delivered by what I appreciate is not your average speaker of English. So here we go. Let's see if you can hear it.
I like things a bit offbeat, me. So I bank with First Direct. Afternoon.
We're not a country of speaking platypuses, but there's the example for you. So I like things a bit offbeat, me. As you can see, appended to the clause, I like things a bit offbeat, is a pronoun me, which seems rather superfluous. This is an example of the Protag construction. And I'm going to talk to you about the key constituent parts of this construction. So what that requires me to do is introduce some terminology. There are three key elements when we consider the form of any construction that involves a tag. There's the tag itself, which Huddleston and Pullen define as a supplement to another clause. There's the anchor, that's the clause that the tag is attached to. And then a bit of terminology of my own is the anchor point. That's the expression within the anchor with which the pronoun in the tag is co-referent. So if we take a look at the essential elements of this construction using our example, we have the pronoun tag, the protag itself, so that's the me at the end. Then there's the anchor, that's the clause that the tag is attached to. And finally, we have the anchor point. That's the expression within the anchor that the pronoun in the tag is co-referent with. So in this case, we have the protag me, first person singular, and the subject I refer to the same entity. So they're co-referential like that. It's important to appreciate that the sentence is completely grammatical without the tag. So I like things a bit offbeat is a perfectly good sentence of British English. So the question then becomes, why would a speaker include the tag? What is its function? It doesn't seem to add anything to the propositional content of the statement. And that's an important question relating to functions that we'll come back to later. But first, I want to share some more about this construction and set out the facts about it, starting with the properties of the protag itself. So we've seen this example here with the personal pronoun me, but demonstrative protags are available too in present-day British English. The singular demonstrative pronouns used as protags are a feature of colloquial British English, but we do see plural demonstrative protags attested as well. Just to say a little bit about the presentation, in the examples that I'll show today, you'll see the protag given in bold, and then the anchor point that it co-refers with is given in blue. And the references for the data here that you'll see, they indicate the corpora that they're taken from. So decta is a corpus of a particular dialect of British English, Tyneside English from the northeast of England, and BNC underneath for there, that refers to the British National Corpus. So those are data taken from anywhere in the UK. But here are examples of demonstrative protags. So in one we have, oh, it's an awkward one, this. In two, a really unhealthy job, that as well. What two shows is that the anchor point needn't be overt. So if we were to reconstruct that sentence and insert a subject, it would be something like, it's a really unhealthy job, or that's a really unhealthy job. And then the that picks it up and co-refers with it. 3 is an interesting example because it shows that these tags can be attached to questions. 3 is a case where we have a yes/no question, were these picked at random, which is followed by a protag and then followed by some kind of colloquial question tag as well. So were these picked at random, these A? Asking a question with those tags attached to it. And then in 4, we have they're nice, those. What 4 shows is that there doesn't have to be identity between the anchor point and the tag. They can have different forms. One thing I want to clarify about functions early on is it might be tempting to look at these and think, I've seen things that have been right dislocated that appear at the end of a clause before, and they have some kind of clarification or elaboration function. Maybe it's a kind of afterthought, but that's not what's going on with these pronoun tags. Pronouns by their nature don't supply more information in a way that a right dislocated noun phrase would. So if we had an utterance like, they're nice, those chocolates, of course, those chocolates, that expression would clarify what they was referring to. They're nice, those doesn't give any more information. It's not necessary to be pointing when you use this. So it's a very different use of a demonstrative. It's also important to appreciate as well that these don't have a contrastive function. So they're not drawing a contrast between something else when they're used. They can be used contrastively, but so can any element with the addition of appropriate stress. But contrast isn't a definitional property of this protag construction. So those are examples with demonstrative protags. We can also use personal pronouns in this way, as you saw with my original example. There is one exception. So a protag can be any personal pronoun in the objective case. So it's things like me, us, them, rather than I, we, they. But you can't use it this way. Instead of it, you would use that or this. And of course, that's actually what we saw in example 1. It's an awkward one, this. It's not possible to say it's an awkward one, it. It is completely ruled out. It's the only personal pronoun that is not available to be used as a tag on its own. With personal pronouns, we've seen an example with me. Here are some examples of other personal pronouns. So 5, he took a loan out for 3 grand him. In 6, we've often seen him in the library her. And in 7, I couldn't make them out them. 6 and 7 are interesting because in that case, you can see that the anchor point isn't restricted to being the subject. In those particular examples, it's the object that's the anchor point, which is picked up on by the pronoun tag. So there's some variation there in the nature of that anchor point. Now, if you were to ask for the opinion of a native speaker of British English, you may find that they query the claim that personal pronouns can be used as tags on their own. So this is absolutely fine in my dialect. My dialect, I can use all demonstrative pronouns in this way and all personal pronouns in this way as well. But there do seem to be differences. Use of this and that, particularly that, seems to be a general feature of colloquial British English. If a speaker can naturally use one of these protags, it's this or that. Then there seems to be another layer of acceptability in terms that some speakers will accept only the pronoun me as the only personal pronoun that can be used in this way, like the example we saw before, which is a TV ad that showed all over the UK. And then a final kind of layer, which seems to be even more restricted in its distribution, is the use of personal pronouns other than me, like you see here. As I said, they're perfectly acceptable in my dialect and in other dialects as well. But the distribution doesn't seem to be as widespread as particularly for that. What's going on there, whether this is a social variation, a regional variation, or a combination of the two, isn't something that is entirely clear yet. But I just wanted to let you know about the restrictions in the possible distribution that we see there. Okay, so I promised in the abstract to talk a little bit about discourse markers, or sometimes they're known as pragmatic markers, but I'll call them discourse markers here today. So I classify protags as discourse markers because they don't contribute to propositional content. They're optional elements. They belong to the expressive part of the linguistic system. They don't change the meaning fundamentally, if we're talking about meaning in a pure propositional semantic sense. Discourse marker is a category that items with a variety of formal properties belong to. So they're often monomorphemic. So they're expressions like well, though, so. But there are also discourse markers that are polymorphemic. So we get expressions like actually, anyway, moreover. And they can even be an entire phrase. Things like I mean, you know. Those sort of little elements that you include that don't really change the propositional content. In terms of their form, they can be variant. So you could use despite, in spite of, in addition to this, in addition to that. But they also can be invariant as well, so not changing their form at all. Things like above all, in summary, or even in it, which is a stigmatized form, but one that you'll find often in colloquial English, at least in the UK. Protags are slightly unusual in the context of discourse markers because they are both variable in form and monomorphemic. So you can see with the examples that we've got here, obviously we have the different forms of the pronouns, but they're all just these single morpheme elements. And we can draw a contrast here between protags and the most directly comparable counterparts that we have in standard English, which are question tags. Question tags are variable in form like protags, but they are comprised of more than one word. So an example of a question tag would be something like, it's been absolutely fantastic, this, hasn't it? Or she's been absolutely fantastic, hasn't she? So we have this little tag at the end with a verb form and then a subject pronoun following. Obviously there you have variability in form as we see with the protag construction, but it's a phrase rather than being monomorphemic. And it's important to appreciate that protags also differ from question tags with respect to what their anchor point can be. Protags are far more permissive than question tags. When you have a question tag, the anchor point has to be a subject. Okay, so we saw earlier on this example, number 6. We've often seen her in the library her. Now, the only possibility for a question tag there would be we've often seen her in the library, haven't we? So the pronoun in the tag would have to refer back to the subject. It could not be, we've often seen her in the library, hasn't she? I have trouble even forming it. It's so strange. So we see that there's a difference here between this protag and the question tag. Question tags can only have an anchor point that's a subject. 6 and 7 are examples of protags where we had a direct object being the anchor point. But also in my corpus research, I found an example of a possessor embedded within a prepositional phrase. So in 9, we have the expression, burns a hole in his pocket him. So this is a colloquial expression, meaning you have some money and you can't wait to spend it. It's burning a hole in your pocket. You want to get rid of it really quickly. Even if we reconstruct the subject in that sentence, it would be something like, it burns a hole in his pocket, or that burns a hole in his pocket. It's clear that the protag him is referring to the possessor within the prepositional phrase. So there are many different options for the grammatical function of an anchor point that make it different from a question tag. And in 10, you've got an example where we show that it could be an indirect object as well. To give you an overview of my previous work on the protag construction in present-day British English, I found that demonstrative protags, so this, that, these, and those, are far more common than personal protags. So there's an 81%, 19% split in the corpus data that I looked at. The grammatical function of the anchor point, I've said it's variable, but it is overwhelmingly the subject, and their inclusion is never obligatory. You could always leave them out. It will be a perfectly well-formed sentence of English. I mentioned earlier that the distribution of the personal pronouns was restricted, so I thought it was very important to go to a corpus of data from a dialect where I knew it was possible for all of the personal pronouns to be used as protags. So I did that. That's where I went to with using the diachronic electronic corpus of Tyneside English, that dialect that I talked about from the northeast of England. What I found interesting was when I isolated that data and looked at that data on its own, the broad generalizations, the fact that there were far more demonstratives than personal protags being used, held even when it was just that dialect in which personal protags were absolutely available. So that preference, that high frequency of demonstrative protags happens even in dialects where personal pronoun tags are definitely available. So that's the current situation. But then what I wanted to do was to investigate how old these were. Where did these come from? I've said they're a feature of colloquial spoken British English. They're not part of the standard, but they are well used in speech, and speakers understand them without problem. So is this a fairly recent occurrence? I guess the worst situation would have been if I'd gone to the historical corpus and found nothing. I would have had an answer to my question, but nothing else to talk about today. But in fact, we did find them. And we found surprisingly that they're a feature of quite long standing. They've been around for a long time in English as spoken in the UK. Of course, I've just said that pronoun tags are a feature of spoken English. So where do you go for examples of spoken English from historical varieties? It's a really big challenge. Well, we know that contemporary drama, so drama of the time, and in particular comedies, perhaps where the speech is supposed to imitate more closely how people spoke day to day, has been identified as the closest available approximate to speech for earlier varieties of English. So first of all, we carried out a pilot study. And we looked at whether there were protags in early modern English. We looked at the works of Ben Jonson, of William Shakespeare, and also Christopher Marlowe, so these very famous playwrights, to see if there were any examples. And we did find examples. So we followed that up by going to a much larger corpus. So that was the Chadwick Healy English Drama Collection. That's a collection of 3,874 plays, which spans from the late 13th century to the early 20th century. And that's about 56 million words of verse and prose. Searching for these things was a challenge because obviously if we just search for personal pronouns and demonstrative pronouns, I wouldn't even be speaking to you now. I wouldn't have any results. We would still be looking at those pronouns. So we decided to narrow things down to be more conservative by conducting corpus searches in which we had a personal or demonstrative pronoun followed by some form of punctuation. This means we have probably got fewer hits than we could have otherwise had, but at least it kept our results to a manageable size. We couldn't look at all of the pronouns. That is what we did with Shakespeare, Johnson and Marlowe, and I don't want to do it again. But searching in this way using punctuation, even though punctuation wasn't standardized at that time, it meant we knew that we were getting actual examples, and if anything, we've got a conservative picture. So that's my caveat about our findings that you're about to see. I'm glad to say we did find examples of the Protag construction, even taking this conservative approach. In fact, what we see is something very, very similar to present-day British English. So we see the same range of examples for each pronoun tag in earlier varieties of English as we saw in present-day British English and in our previous, more limited sample of early modern English. So in 11, you see, "'Tis good tobacco this." This is good tobacco. So "'tis" being an abbreviation for "it is." So you can see that even in the 17th century there, protag "this" is being used with an anchor point "it," an abbreviated one. Again, we see "'tis" being used in 12. "Oh, take heed, sir, 'tis against nature that." In 13, we have an example which shows that the object could be the anchor point in the 17th century in an example from Shakespeare's Hamlet, but you shall hear these in her excellent white bosom these. So "these" is picked up in both of those cases there. And then 14 is an example where the anchor point is covert, so it's not explicitly present. "Good lads those, they kill themselves, give me such foes." So we see the full range of demonstrative protags. We also see the full range of personal protags. I should say that our research on demonstrative protags in the Chadwick-Healy corpus data has been completed, but our work on personal protags is ongoing. Having said that, we have found evidence of their occurrence. So we see the examples in 15 to 18. "Gentlemen, you are wits. I am a dull country rogue, I," which simply means, you know, you're sparkling, intelligent people, and I'm just a simple person, so being very humble. In 16, we have "like wax, she'll take any impression, sir, she." You can see then that actually the protag doesn't immediately have to follow the clause in a sense, because we've got that vocative "sir" in there as well. So it can be separated from the clause that it refers to. In 17, we have the second person singular form "thou," which of course isn't part of current English. "Thou art my saviour or my preserver, thou." And then finally, they use it in their prayers, they. One thing you will have noticed is that the form of the pronoun is different. In earlier varieties, the protag appears in the nominative form. So we have "I," not "me." We have "she," not "her." We have "they," not "them." This isn't something specific to protag. This is a more general difference in the form of pronouns over time. So in earlier varieties of English, the default form for a pronoun would be the nominative, as you see here. But that has changed over time. This is a more general change that happened. So now the default form of the pronoun in present-day English is the non-nominative form. That is why you get prescriptivists complaining about uses such as "me and him went to the shops." "Me" and "him" there appear in their default forms. Of course, you know, a prescriptivist working on the basis of the older default forms would say "I and he went to the shops," but this sounds very, very formal in spoken colloquial English. Okay, one final thing I want to point out there is that you can see that this construction has been available for a long time. Example 17 there is from the first half of the 16th century. So this is not, which was kind of a surprise to me, this is not a modern thing. This has been part of English for a long time, but it's never been part of standard English. It's always been part of the colloquial form. And in terms of the overview, well, as in present-day British English, we saw all demonstrative pronouns were attested, and we saw that the singular was far more common than the plural. So this, that were more common than these and those. Of course, that's true for present-day British English, but what has changed is the fact that this is more common than that in earlier varieties. It's only in the early 20th century that we see that become the most commonly used of the two protags. So a switch has happened there, and a switch has happened quite recently with respect to that. And our work on personal protags is ongoing in historical varieties. So that's to give you an idea of the construction and its history. But now let's take a look at its functions. And protags seem to fall quite neatly into what Longacre termed mystery particles. Sounds very exciting. It's always nice to present it like this. And actually, I include his full quote here because I think it really sums up the conversations that I've had with native speakers of British English about the protag construction. So he says, typically the native speaker uses such items with complete assurance, but is unable to verbalize anything very concrete as to their meaning and function. They are simply salt and peppered through a text to give it flavor. Almost inevitably, mystery particles of this sort are found to have a function which relates to a unit larger than a sentence, i.e. to the paragraph and the discourse. And this provides further support for the classification of protags as discourse markers. Speakers use them, they're not sure why. While discourse markers such as protags don't have propositional content, it would not be correct to say that they're meaningless in some way. They can have lots to contribute. So Beeching says discourse markers are notoriously both polysemous and multifunctional. Like when it's used as a discourse marker, might be considered to be simultaneously a hesitation marker, an identity marker, an approximator, and a focuser. And this is true also for protags, as we'll see. The question then becomes, they might be meaningless in a semantic propositional sense, but what are protags doing there? Why do speakers add them when their presence is never required? What does that achieve when it comes to the speaker packaging the message that they want to communicate? And we're going to start by considering the protag itself before we move on to the construction as a whole. Now, at one level, the key factor is information structure and the coherence that's created within the context of the wider discourse. So working with present-day British English data, the mini dialogue in 19 and 20 show that the protag has to refer to an entity that is old or can be assumed to be familiar to the hearer. Because it is true, when the anchor point is overt, it's a pronoun. Okay, so the question and answer pair in 19 show that the anchor point can't be new information. It cannot be the answer constituent. So who married Tom? Sue married him. Sue is the new information there, clearly. And it's fine to use a question tag with that. Sue married him, didn't she? But you cannot use a protag. Sue married him, her. The reason being that Sue is new information. Only old information is available to be the anchor point. So 20 is fine. Who did Sue marry? She married John, her. She married John, didn't she? Both of those are fine. So we again see a difference between question tags and pronoun tags. She in 20 is old information because it's included in the question. Why is that? Well, this has all the hallmarks of the protag being a kind of topic marking device. Topic marking at or towards the end of the clause might be unexpected, but as I continue to work, a hypothesis that I want to test further is that actually what that protag might be doing there on one level is flagging up a possible topic candidate for the dialogue or text that follows. So it could be a way of the speaker kind of prompting textual cohesion by saying, this is our topic, this is what we're talking about, take that on. Either understand that in my next utterance, or you should pick up talking about Sue in this case in what you go on to say. So that's something that I need to explore more in terms of larger textual cohesion. But at the moment, that's my hypothesis about what the protag's doing there. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that. This isn't the only dimension of function that we have to consider, though, because simultaneously, the entire protag construction has its own functions. And because this hadn't really been explored before, I had to find some sort of a framework to think about these functions in. And what I did was go to question tags. I've said there are differences, but question tags are the most well-known and well-researched examples of tags in English. So I looked at work on their functions as a useful starting point for comparison. So what you see here is a proposal for the functional classification of question tags by Barron et al. From 2015. Question tags, the name might imply that they always have a questioning function, but they don't. They're actually really multifaceted markers that do a lot of different work in terms of pragmatics. And when I looked at this classification, not all of it was relevant to pronoun tags, but 2 sets of functions from this taxonomy proved to be relevant. So first of all, there was this subtype statements, which has its own subtypes, 4 of them there, which I'll talk you through the definition of shortly. And then also I found examples from this desired action, give, offers, advice, and suggestions as well. I set aside the other subtype of desired action because that's demands. That's about requests or commands. But it wasn't clear to me that what would count as examples of that function would be distinct from vocatives, like sit down, you know, you're demanding, you're requesting, you're commanding somebody to do that. I did find examples of giving, offers, advice, or suggestions, though, so we kept that in. A word of warning, I'm going to talk about definitions and exemplify as well. But when I pick out a function for a pronoun tag construction, I've said they're inherently polyfunctional. When I present an example, it's just because it's a good example of one of those functions. That doesn't mean it's the only function that that protag would have in that particular context, and context is very important. They can have multiple functions, but I've chosen to exemplify one of them using a particular instance. So let's look at some data and let's look at some definitions as well. So Barron et al. Defines statements as being used to give information. The primary knower is the speaker. They do not expect a response. And then they identify 4 subtypes. The first one I'm calling attitudinal. In the original classification, this was called stating a fact or an opinion, but I want to use attitudinal instead because talking about a fact could wrongly give the impression that objectivity is being involved here, when really it's about subjectivity. So I want to step away from fact and move it more to a discussion of the speaker's attitude. But we're going to take a look at each of these in turn. So we'll start with that attitudinal function. This communicates facts or expresses the speaker's personal beliefs, assessments, or attitudes, whether they're positive or negative, towards a topic or the addressee. And more specifically, by using the protag construction, the speaker expresses strong commitment to the truth value of the proposition. This is apparent because we find the anchor can just be used on its own to perfectly well express the speaker's opinion. So we can say it's a good book, or we can say it's a good book that. Nothing's changed there about expressing the speaker's opinion. What the pronoun tag does is just say that I'm strongly committed to this being a good book. We see other discourse markers with a similar intensifying function. So Haslow discussed the use of anyway at the end of a clause. And he highlights the difference here between I don't like coffee and I don't like coffee anyway. When you have anyway at the end, it just reinforces the fact that you really don't like that. Final thing to say about attitudinal before I show you some examples is that this is the most common use of the most common function of protags by far. So here we see some examples of that, both from the present day British English data in 21 and 23, and then where you see the playwright's name and the date in 22 and 24, those are the historical examples. So it was good fun that. 'Tis goodly language this, what would it mean? This is fine language. She can be funny her, you know, another discourse marker follows the protag there, and a most strange lady she. It's striking that so many examples of protag use, whether in present-day English or a historical variety, are used with evaluative expressions. So positive or negative expressions like good fun in 21, goodly meaning fine in 22, funny in 23, and then, of course, most strange in 24. So it's about reinforcing those attitudes, the use that we have here. We also find examples with the function of acknowledging response. What that means is that the speaker acknowledges the addressee's preceding assertion and then signals into personal accord with it. So they're basically expressing agreement. So a modern example would be the dialogue in 25. You see the quality, it's good quality that. Okay, you could say it's good quality and that would be fine. But the pronoun tag really reinforces the responder's agreement and builds that into personal accord. We see that also in the 19th century drama in example 26. Chalcott says, did she find it out? Sir Alexander says, unfortunately she did. So obviously a negative assessment. And then Chalcott says, nuisance that. He agrees with him that it's unfortunate that that happened, and the pronoun tag just reinforces his agreement. In each dialogue, the speaker uses a protag construction to signal interpersonal accord by acknowledging the speaker's utterance, their assessment, and agreeing with it, reinforcing it. As a positive use, we also have a more negative use. So the challenging use of protags represents an attack. The subject of the attack is teased or mocked, contradicted, maybe even threatened, accused, or reproached in order to gain power by undermining their positive face. So in 27, there's this statement, God, I'd kill her, I'd get rid of her, me. This is unfortunately teenage girls speaking about another teenage girl who isn't present. There's a threat, but clearly it's to a third person. The part that's underlined there is underlined because it indicates how my definition differs from Barron et al.'s original definition of the challenging function. They refer to a direct attack on the addressee, but that's not quite right for protags, because I found that the subject of the threat doesn't have to be directly attacked or even be present at the time when the challenging statement is made. And that's the case in example 27. 28 is different. That's a straight on attack to the person that you're speaking to. Come, you are a fool, you. So he dismisses the person he's speaking to as a fool, a direct challenge, a face-threatening act, and very deliberately so. Moving away from threatening, we come to a much more pleasant use, and that is for conversational joking. So in this case, the construction enables the speaker to present a personality, to share experiences and attitudes, and promote rapport in an entertaining fashion. There are some clues for this use. It may involve irony or understatement and be accompanied by laughter. So the present-day British English example I have for you here is actually from a patient-doctor interaction. And I think this is really interesting because, of course, it is in the doctor's and the patient's as well, but it's in the doctor's interest that he builds rapport with his patient. And so we see this type of protag function here. So the patient says something and then the doctor responds by laughing. There's that cue. That's a story, that. And then the patient goes on to talk about how they have wax in their ears, and the doctor goes on to talk about the diagnosis. The doctor's comments are consistent with being aimed at promoting rapport with the patient. He could have just said that's a story. He chose to say that's a story, that, to have this conversational joking, this reinforcement. Notice that the doctor's comment doesn't receive a response from the patient. The doctor doesn't follow it up, but there is some accompanying laughter there. So this seems to have this kind of joking use between the two. We also find this in historical dramas. So this is from the 17th century. This is an example from a Ben Jonson play. Let me tell you a little bit about who uses this so we can understand more about why they use the protag construction. So Fungoso is the son of a farmer, but really he wants to be in the royal court. He wants to be a royal attendant, an important person. So he's always trying to make himself look better and seem more important. So he's had this suit made. He says, "How likest thou my suit, haberdasher?" How do you like my suit? And the haberdasher, somebody who didn't make the suit, is flattering Fungoso. He says, "By troth, sir, 'tis very rarely well made. I never saw a suit sit better, I can tell on." So he said, "Oh, it looks so amazing on you." Now, by saying this, the haberdasher indirectly flatters the tailor, the person who made the suit, too. He's praising the tailor's work. And then the tailor uses the protag construction in a way to modestly reject the compliment about his work. So the tailor says, "Nay, we have no art to please our friends, we." What he's saying there is, "Oh, we don't have the skills to satisfy our customers." So he's being very modest, going, "Oh, no, this suit is nothing. It doesn't look so great." Clearly, again, the conversational joking, having a bit of modesty. He knows it's good, otherwise the guy wouldn't be buying his suit, right? But he is, shaking off that compliment. And then finally, we come to this desired action give function. So this is where we have a commissive or directive used in the exchange of goods and services rather than particularly information. And with specifically give, the action concerns offering advice or making an offer or a suggestion. What it's doing here, the use here is mitigating a potentially face-threatening act. If you're giving somebody advice, you don't know if they're going to take it so well, so you need to mitigate that. Here's an example from present-day British English, and interestingly, this is from a tutoring session. So this is a GCSE maths tutoring session. So it's a dialogue between the teacher, J, and the student, who is A, and that student will be a 14 to 16-year-old school pupil. Given the situation, it's not surprising to find a giving advice example, and the use of the Protag construction just, kind of softens things a little bit. So the teacher is talking them through some maths calculation, and you can see in the third line, 1 point, and there's that pause that all teachers know when you're trying to get the student to realize that maybe they've made a mistake, but you don't want to tell them straight away. So you pause, what would you? And then the student gets it. Oh, 08. Yeah, sorry, 08. And then you can see that the teacher responds with, yeah, okay. That's the only thing to watch that. What they mean is that's the thing to watch out for in the future. Okay, so he's giving him advice. Be aware of that. Make sure you don't do that in the future. And we see the same kind of giving advice function in historical dramas as well. So in this particular case, we have a chamberlain. He's seeking to reassure Orestes by advising him that the room that they're discussing is the most private one and therefore would be best suited to the king. So Orestes says, is this the room, friend, where the king must be? And the chamberlain says, yes, this is the room, sir. 'Tis the privatest, this. So he's reinforcing that's a good choice. I'm advising you, put him in here. So those are the functions of the Protag construction which are attested in both present-day British English and historical varieties of English in our corpus. Before we consider general trends, I just want to share with you an observation that came out of working with the data from historical dramas specifically, and that relates to the occurrence of Protag constructions in asides to the audience. This is something that the interns who were working with me found repeatedly in the data and drew to my attention. So I'm really grateful to them for doing that, because what we find is the Protag used as a dramatic device. Because as well as building, maintaining, strengthening and weakening relations between the characters on the stage, playwrights used the Protag construction in asides to the audience, breaking the fourth wall in order to more directly involve the audience. So it's like the character is taking the audience into their confidence. So in 33, Valentine says to the audience, a vulgar fellow this, but I'll touch his cash and then get rid of him. And then he returns to the character and says, won't you please to sit, sir? And he's very nice to the character he's spoken to. But previously what he's told the audience is, this guy is awful. I'm just going to take his money and then I'll get rid of him. He'll be gone. So it's a way that playwrights have used this construction in order to share the personal evaluation of a character and then bring speakers closer to the action. Sorry, the audience closer to the action. So an aside about asides, but I think it's interesting because that's how they're being used as a dramatic device. Those functions that we've identified, we can also categorize them into broader classifications. And so I was interested in the idea of the three-way distinction that Traugott proposes based on insights from Halliday and Hassan. So Traugott distinguishes between the propositional component. Obviously, the presence of discourse markers doesn't affect propositional propositional content, so we're not too interested in that. The textual component concerns the relations within a discourse, and then the interpersonal is concerned with the interpersonal relationships between participants. So it relates to the relationship between the speaker and the addressee, and that can be divided into speaker-oriented functions, which are identified as subjective, so about the speaker's attitudes and opinions, while addressee-oriented functions are called intersubjective. In Mycock and Pang 2021, we discussed how the core meaning of the Protag construction is subjective. So its occurrence serves to express or reinforce the speaker's commitment to a proposition. So it's about the speaker's relationship to what they're saying. An intersubjective function, on the other hand, encodes the speaker's attention to the self of addressee and his or her needs concerning the processing of the message. While the protag construction has a core subjective meaning, we have, as you've seen, found that it can have intersubjective functions as well. And we can group those functions from Baron et al.'s system according to whether they're subjective or intersubjective. So the statement category, we've seen it doesn't expect a response and is divided into these 4 subtypes. We can see that attitudinal would be classed as subjective in nature, whereas the other 3, they're actually classed as intersubjective. And intersubjective would also be an appropriate classification for the other function identified. So they're all interpersonal on this system, but we can distinguish subjective, the core meaning, from intersubjective. I've presented a pretty coherent picture, but there are a couple of key differences that I just want to finish with to tell you about, because we do see some differences. So there is an intersubjective function attested in historical varieties that we don't see in present-day British English, and that's a question function. And then also in present-day British English, we find that there's a discourse-oriented deictic use, and that creates that's used to create textual coherence, so a slightly different type of function there. The question function, it's rare, but it does occur. They're used to seek information, and we see an example of that in 34. The captain says, "Good morrow, brother soldier." A good handsome girl, that. And then Pat's response is, "She's thought so, sir." So he is confirming that, but the captain is asking a question about whether the girl is attractive, and is using that question there, not a question tag, but a question. A question tag alternative would be something like, "She's a good, handsome girl, isn't she?" But that's clearly not what we've got here. We've got the use of that, which is interesting because it's not a personal pronoun, of course. We find a small number of examples of this historically, but not in present-day British English. In fact, here's a comparison of the functions of protag constructions in present-day British English and the demonstrative protag constructions in our historical corpus. What's interesting is you can see that attitudinal is by far the most common. And so that reinforces this idea that the core meaning, the function, the main function, is subjective. The rest are intersubjective. They're far smaller, but you can see by comparing those figures that we've got that we see an increase in intersubjective functions in the present-day British English data compared to the historical data. So it does seem that there is more use of intersubjective functions, but it is still overwhelmingly a construction that's used with a subjective meaning. And a final example, I mentioned earlier that the protag construction in present-day British English appears to have developed a function that hasn't been identified in historical varieties. And that's one which creates textual cohesion. So something that has a discourse-oriented function, not a speaker or a hearer function. So 35 is that example. Brian Jackson was very pleased with himself. From his promising interview with the redoubtable Mrs. Fitton, he had driven directly to Mansfield Memorial Hospital with medical records in mind. Initiative, that. Now, the referent, the antecedent that we could construct of the protag, that in 35, isn't an entity or a person. Instead, it actually refers to the propositions that are expressed previously in the text. What shows initiative? Well, that he had gone straight from an interview to the hospital with the aim of doing something relating to medical records. So the result here is that the protag construction is discourse-oriented. It refers to a whole chunk of ideas previously expressed, and that creates some sort of textual cohesion. So in terms of functions over time, increased discourse orientation has been identified as a strong tendency in meaning change, and the final stage of grammaticalization following speaker orientation, the subjective, and hearer orientation, intersubjective. And so what we see when we see this development of different functions in the protag construction is actually what Narok proposes as a developmental pathway, that we start with something that is subjective, it becomes intersubjective, and then the final stage is discourse oriented. But what doesn't change is there's still that subjective orientation. So my conclusion then, we still have to work on personal pronouns, but we see that the protag construction is indeed a long-standing feature of colloquial British English that is used to organize the flow of information. Diachronically, from a historical perspective, the picture is one of general stability. We see intersubjective uses increasing slightly, but increasing, building on that core subjective use. And they're used to construct, reinforce, destroy, or reconfigure interpersonal relationships. And finally, a discourse-oriented use appears to be emerging in present-day British English. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Louise Mycock. That was really very interesting, that insightful, highly informative. So now time to take questions, if there are any. Thank you. Before giving the floor to questions, that I found that really very interesting, because you are more familiar with the description of the standard variety of English, the modern standard English. So that's very interesting to learn about British colloquial, these protag structure, and how you manage to first have the formal description and then the functional analysis, the discourse functions of this tag. That's very interesting. I do have a couple of questions, but I think I'll give the floor first to the participants. Yes, Nasreen, you raised your hand. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Louise. That was really inspiring. Now, it's sometimes amazing how we use the language and we don't sometimes reflect on how we are using it. Because instances like the ones you've mentioned, I believe they are cross-linguistic. We use them in our Tunisian Arabic. We use them in Italian. If we think about it, we also use them in French. So this is a phenomenon that is somehow cross-linguistic. And I've never thought about that, to be honest. I'm very much aware of question tags. It's part of how we've been taught the language, the standard language, but probably not the dialect. Now, out of curiosity, I was wondering whether you had a look at any varieties of American English, like spoken American English, and to see if and whether there are any similarities, any differences. First of all, if the phenomenon exists, which my hunch tells me, yes, they do, but then whether or not they are used to fulfill the same functions, for instance, just, out of curiosity. And thank you so much for that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because they're so old, which was a surprise to me that you find them in these old texts. Yeah, of course, this, predates, we're coming up to 250 years of America and blah, blah, blah. So you would wonder if, at least in North America, you would find them. I haven't looked at it specifically, but anecdotally, no, which really surprised me. I presented this at a conference, and Sally Tagliamonte came to me and said, you just don't get them in Canadian English. She was not aware of them. She looked through her own databases of British English and found a few of them, but no. So it seems to be something that is peculiarly British English, which is why I was very careful to kind of go present-day British English. And actually, they're a really unusual, thinking typologically, they're a really unusual feature for Germanic. Now, in Romance languages, I think this is not a surprise. I've presented some of this to French speakers, and they've gone, that's just French. I don't know what you're excited about. I don't think it is French. I thought for a while, maybe there is a kind of historical language context situation here. Of course, lots of French influence in English, but it seems to go much further back. We've got at least one example from Old English. And also when the French came in, they were the top level of society. It was the language of law and culture and power. It wasn't really a kind of coming in at the sort of everyday speech kind of level. So this left me with a real query. It's very unusual. You don't get them in German. The only Germanic languages that you find them in are the Scandinavian languages. So there could be a possibility that what you get is some sort of contact way back when, where we're invaded by Scandinavians and they bring it with them. And certainly there is an idea, if you talk to native speakers, particularly about the personal pronouns, they say, that's a Northern thing. Northern speakers use that. I don't think so. I thought that, to be honest, at first. But when I looked at the data, I don't know that it's that clearly cut. I think it might be in present-day British English more about class than it is specifically about region. But that could possibly be it, because the Scandinavian languages do have that. However, I've spoken to experts in Old Norse, there's no evidence that existed in Old Norse. So I still remain with this query about where it comes from. For what it's worth, I think the Romance languages, I think the functions are slightly different. I think there's more of a contrastive use there, but it's certainly an interesting one to look at and think about these tiny little things. With discourse markers, we're used to them being maybe small comments like I mean or you think, not pronouns. Pronouns don't get usually used like this, except, as you pointed out, they do get used like this. So why is that? What's going on there? What is the origin story?
Yeah,
Thank
that's
you.
very interesting indeed. I think we have another question from Dr. Faisal Malaj. So Faisal, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks a lot for this evidence-based and purpose-driven presentation. It's very interesting, actually. I have a couple of interrelated points concerning the terminology. I noticed that you have used interchangeably SFL terminology, traditional terminology, and formal semantics like truth value, propositional content. Is it an attempt to maybe to reconcile existing theories or to enrich SFL terminology? My second point is about the locus of protags. You insisted on attitudinal and intersubjective function, but I mean, do you mean is it still within the interpersonal function, or is it actually spread to the textual and ideational? So, by the way, you have used it's very informative to me to maybe to ask about your interchangeable use of ideational and propositional, which I find very amazing, actually, because SFL, is it because SFL is not autonomous terminology in terms of terminology, or is it an attempt to reconcile formal semantics with SFL? A final question is about the frequency distribution. You have identified 19% pronominal, and you spoke about nominative versus accusative. Have you found any genitive, reflexive pronominal forms? And this leads me to my final comment. Do you intend to conduct any contrastive linguistic analysis like Dr. Nesrine suggested? Because in French, there's this protag, but it's basically a positive immediately after the subject rather than extraposition as in English. So this is maybe worth investigating. I mean, if we know that functional systemic linguistics is actually universal rather than located or maybe limited to English. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks. Okay, so I've made notes, but tell me if I miss anything. So with the terminology, I was aware that of what this forum is for, and I'm kind of atheoretical in this sense, and so it was an attempt to kind of reach out to you and maybe find some common ground between all of us. I am all in favor of whatever anybody's persuasion is to come together and actually work together to find ways forward. And so it was my, I hope it wasn't too clumsy, attempt to sort of speak your language and maybe share a bit of my language with you as well, to try and find exactly.
Sorry to interrupt, Louise. That was excellent. But we noticed that you had this intention to reconcile and to touch upon the audience, and that was an excellent attempt. It was not clumsy at all.
Okay, I wasn't sure. So I'm still finding my way around your terminology and your concepts, and I was definitely trying to do, as you said, find that kind of common ground so that we could open up some dialogue. Because I think if there's one thing that linguistics suffers for, particularly coming from a syntax background, I feel this quite strongly, is that sometimes we're trying to do the same things in different theoretical frameworks, and we don't really come together enough. So that's the reason for maybe mixing and matching the terminology a bit. With the interpersonal and the textual, so I was going from Traugott's definition there of saying that the interpersonal functions could be divided into subjective and intersubjective. So if you are happy to consider subjective interpersonal, then I would say they are all interpersonal uses, but I think it's important to distinguish subjective from intersubjective, because then what it allows us to do is go, there is a core meaning, and the core meaning is different from the other uses. The other uses build on it, and they very much build on this idea of a core meaning, which is to show the strength of the commitment on the speaker's part to the proposition that it accompanies. If I say it's a good book, and I add it's a good book, that nothing changes about my assessment. What I'm doing to you by having that little thing there, it just flags to you that I strongly am committed to this. I want you to agree with me, or I'm saying you should go out and buy this book, it's amazing. With the textual thing, I think that's interesting, because what Narog says in that developmental pathway, if we're looking at discourse-oriented uses, then it seems like we're coming back to the textual, and therefore the presentation of kind of propositional, textual, interpersonal, I don't think should be taken as kind of one step after the other, some sort of developmental pathway of its own. The discourse-oriented version, according to Narog, is what comes last. And so therefore we start with something, presumably at some point it had some propositional content, because otherwise why was it there? It loses that through the kind of usual grammaticalization process of semantic bleaching, so it loses its propositional content. Then we get to interpersonal uses, divide into subjective and intersubjective. But finally, that discourse-oriented one, so it does seem to come and fall into that textual part. So that's Narog's developmental pathway, and I thought it was very persuasive for the data that I've got. In terms of frequency distribution, I think the form of the pronoun tag itself is dictated by what is the default form of pronouns at that time. So I've seen no evidence of genitives, no evidence of reflexive forms. As a speaker, a native speaker of a dialect which has all of those personal pronouns as a possibility, I've never heard it. I would never use it. So I don't think there's a huge amount of variability. It is that you can use a pronoun, and what is the default form of the pronoun in English at that point. And then in terms of a cross-linguistic comparison, I would love to. I am not a speaker of any Romance languages, so that's going to involve me finding some collaborators who want to take this on. But I feel like this is really, an open goal, and it would be really, really great to look at that and compare it. I did look at a time at old Scandinavian texts, because of course you can have this construction in Swedish. And with a colleague, I looked at translations of Shakespeare. What we found that was interesting was that where Shakespeare had a protag construction, there wasn't one in the Swedish translation. But the Swedish translation included pronoun tags elsewhere where Shakespeare hadn't. And so there is something different going on there. And I think possibly translations would be a useful point to look at.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Those were all super interesting questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, yeah, we are a bit late, but I really can't help asking you one. In fact, I did have two questions, but I'll go briefly to with what I think the more important one about the impact of the co-text in the interpretation of the function of the protag, because I noticed in your classification of the functions of the protag that it's highly influenced by the co-text. For example, initiative, that. In fact, it's not only that conveys the textual metafunction, but also the summary word. And I wonder if there is any systematic way of including these contextual cues in the interpretation of the meaning or of the function of the protag.
Yeah, it's really important. And the last piece of work that we completed, we looked at exactly that. So I went through all the examples and looked at the anchors and assessed, are these neutral? Do they include positive lexical items? Do they include negative lexical items? And we saw a preference for positive lexical items. And so what I think is really important is to do exactly what you said. In terms of the interpretation, I think I'm only at the stage of making kind of blanket statements, but it's very important to look at those assessments and go, is it positive? Is it negative? As I said, leave them out, that positive or negative assessment still remains. But I think what is crucial is that subjective function, right? It's saying, here's my opinion, or here's some sort of statement. I am strongly committed to this for whatever reason, to challenge you, to agree with you, whatever, but I'm strongly committed to that. And I think that's what's at the core.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you again for this interesting, highly informative presentation. That was really very interesting. Sorry, Ingrid, for keeping you waiting for a couple of minutes, but we started later. Now it's time
to just interrupt you for a second,
yes.
Stop this recording, and so that we can start Ingrid's perhaps recording later.
Okay, so maybe before we start Ingrid's recording, I shall ask her for permission.
Absolutely.
Ingrid, would you mind that we record your present? You don't mind, or you do? You do?
No,
mind?
no, no. I answered your reply to your email. Yes.
Thank you very